They called me a nobody. Security almost didn't let me in. My invitation wasn't on the list, even though my name paid for the chandeliers above their heads. I watched my ex-business partner raise a glass to my failure under the same lights I'd bought. What they didn't know? By midnight, the hotel they were celebrating in would legally belong to me, and when they announced the new owner, every whisper in that ballroom went silent. They called me a nobody. That's how it started. 3 words whispered too loudly at a table covered in gold linen and old money. I'd been invited to the Hathaway Foundation Gala as a courtesy, or so they said. A pity invitation, extended by people who built fortunes on names I once put in front of them. When I arrived, the woman at the check-in desk scanned the list twice before asking if I was sure I was in the right place. I smiled. I was. Just not for the reason they expected. The ballroom glittered in a way that only money can fake. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen rain. Violins whispered through the speakers, and champagne shimmered in flutes that probably cost more than my first apartment. Every table was marked with names that had weight: law firms, venture funds, legacy dynasties, and then me, Maya Reed, former consultant, current nothing. I took a seat at the far end of the room, close enough to watch, far enough to be ignored. My ex-business partner, Julian Hart, was front and center. Perfect tux, perfect smirk, perfect lie. A year ago, we'd shared an office, a dream, and a company I'd built from scratch. He'd taken my contacts, my investors, and my reputation, then rewritten history to make himself the visionary. The industry believed him. I disappeared quietly, or so it seemed. The master of ceremonies tapped the microphone. Tonight, we honor the man who turned a small idea into an empire, Julian Hart, CEO of Hart Global. I watched him rise, soaking in the adoration like light through glass. He thanked his mentors, his loyal team, even his former partner who taught him humility. The audience laughed. I didn't. I just traced the rim of my champagne glass and thought about how irony tastes better chilled. The servers moved in rhythm. Silver trays, white gloves, curated smiles. Across the room, I caught the flash of a familiar emerald gown. Serena Vale, the woman Julian left me for. A PR executive who specialized in rewriting villains as visionaries. She'd built his redemption arc and sold it to Forbes as a love story. She smiled at me from across the room, pity disguised as kindness. I smiled back, serenity wrapped around vengeance. Because while they dined under borrowed grandeur, I'd spent the last 11 months reconstructing my empire, quietly, legally, and with exquisite precision. The kind of revenge you sign with a pen, not poison. Julian thought he'd ruined me when he forced me out of our company. What he didn't realize was that I'd taken something far more valuable than a title: his data, his suppliers, and every contact that once called him sir. Through shell corporations and holding companies, Terran Group, Elysian Partners, and finally, Marlowe Acquisitions, I'd been buying assets. Not his company. Not yet. But everything surrounding it. The logistics firm, the vendor contracts, and the property his company rented their headquarters in. Julian was technically paying me rent. He just didn't know it yet. And tonight, the crown jewel, the Hathaway Hotel, the same building hosting this glittering hypocrisy. I'd finalized the acquisition hours ago, signing the last document in a private suite upstairs, with my attorney confirming the transfer of ownership effective at midnight. When the papers cleared, the venue, the staff, the security, the champagne, the chandeliers, would all belong to me. So I let them laugh, let them toast to my irrelevance, because revenge doesn't need an audience. It needs timing. And in less than an hour, the very floor beneath their designer shoes would change owners. Julian raised his glass toward me across the room. To the people who taught us what failure looks like, he said, smirking. I lifted mine in return. And to those who mistake silence for weakness, I whispered. The orchestra swelled, the room spun in gold and arrogance, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. I wasn't there for validation. I was there for closure, for the moment their laughter would turn into the kind of silence that follows realization. If you've ever been underestimated by people who didn't know who they were really talking to, stay with me, because this is how you turn humiliation into ownership. And when you disappear, people stop looking for you. That's the first lesson I learned after Julian forced me out of Hart Global. One week, I was the quiet architect behind a multi-million-dollar consulting empire, signing contracts, presenting strategies, building bridges. The next, My email access was revoked, my keycard deactivated, and my name erased from the company's website before I'd even cleared my desk. The statement they released was diplomatic, of course. Maya Reed is pursuing new opportunities. Translation? She's gone, and we're better for it. The industry believed him. Why wouldn't they? Julian had the confidence of a man who'd never been told no. He spoke in firm handshakes and practiced sincerity. I had silence, and silence is expensive. I spent the first month answering questions from journalists, investors, and friends with polite vagueness. Just moving in a new direction, taking a break. They all nodded, already distracted by the next headline. I wasn't a story anymore. I was a footnote. But while Julian celebrated his public victory, I was learning the second lesson, the power of invisibility. The moment people stop expecting you to win, you're free to move without noise. I rented a one-bedroom apartment above a florist in the part of town where no one wore designer suits. I sold my car, closed my social accounts, and started showing up in places that smelled like ink, sweat, and ambition. The kind of spaces where real entrepreneurs are born. There's a peculiar relief in losing everything. The fear of falling vanishes when you've already hit the ground. What's left is hunger. I took on freelance clients under an alias, L. Marlowe. The name came from my grandmother, Lillian Marlowe, who used to tell me that the best revenge was competence. Under that name, I rebuilt. I worked 16-hour days consulting for companies that Julian's firm had once ignored. Emerging markets, minority founders, sustainability startups. The ones he called non-scalable. Within 6 months, my alias had more clients than Hart Global did. By the time I opened a business account for Marlowe Acquisitions, I'd memorized every legal loophole Julian used to protect his wealth. I mirrored them, improved them, and turned them into my own defense system. No public filings under my real name, no paper trail connecting me to the companies quietly absorbing his ecosystem. I wasn't competing with him directly. I was replacing his foundation brick by brick. Some nights I'd scroll through the photos from industry events. Julian's arm around Serena, their smiles bright and curated. Comment sections full of admiration. Power couple goals. What an inspiration. I'd sip cheap wine from a mug and whisper to myself, enjoy it while it lasts. Because I wasn't chasing applause anymore. I was collecting leverage. I began by targeting Hart Global's suppliers. It took 3 months of negotiations and one late-night video call with a distributor in Singapore to buy out the firm that handled their packaging logistics. Then came the analytics firm they used for performance reports, bought through a holding company registered in Zurich. One acquisition at a time, I dismantled his support structure. He didn't even notice. When you're standing under spotlights, you never see who's cutting the wires. Still, the silence was heavy. Success in the shadows is a lonely kind of victory. My phone barely rang. My world shrank to spreadsheets, legal documents, and coffee cups. The people who used to call me brilliant now called me brave, the polite term for broken. I missed being seen, but I knew visibility came with risk. I told myself I'd return to the world when it was safe, when I could walk into a room and not flinch at the mention of his name. That moment came unexpectedly. A journalist published a glowing feature about Julian's philanthropic leadership and included a line that made me laugh out loud. Hart Global has pledged $5 million to restore the historic Hathaway Hotel as part of its community renewal project. The same hotel I'd been negotiating to purchase for months through Marlowe Acquisitions. His PR stunt had accidentally driven down the asking price by making the property look like a liability instead of an asset. I took it as a sign. The final purchase required everything I'd learned in exile. Quiet financing, strategic partnerships, the patience to let paperwork become a weapon. When the deal closed, I sat in the empty lobby of the Hathaway and listened to the echo of my footsteps. The marble floors had seen a century of power games, men toasting success, women pretending not to see betrayal. Now they would see something different. That night, I stood at the tall glass windows overlooking the city and made a promise to myself. I wouldn't settle for revenge that burned everything down. I wanted elegance, revenge that educated, that reminded the powerful that silence doesn't equal surrender. The next gala invitation arrived 2 weeks later, embossed and heavy, the same golden font as always. This time, it wasn't a courtesy. It was an opportunity. I RSVP'd yes, and under company name, I wrote Marlowe Acquisitions Group, because sometimes the best way to return is not as who they remember, but as the name they never saw coming. And the first rule of reclaiming power is understanding that invitation lists are just mirrors of ego. They're not about who deserves to be there. They're about who can make others feel important. I learned that early, watching Julian charm his way into boardrooms by pretending to admire men he secretly despised. The gala invitation sitting on my desk gleamed like a challenge. The embossed seal of the Hathaway Foundation shimmered under the lamp, and below the gold lettering, my alias, L. Marlowe, CEO, Marlowe Acquisitions Group. No one would connect the name to the woman Julian once humiliated. I wasn't Maya Reed, the ghost of his past. I was the founder of a rising private equity firm, whose portfolio read like a lesson in poetic irony. Half of our holdings supplied or serviced Hart Global. The other half quietly replaced it. I'd bought the seat at the table he once refused to share with me. Now I was redesigning the table itself. Still, appearances mattered. In the world Julian worshipped, money without presentation was just potential. Influence required spectacle. I reached out to my stylist, Nadia, the only person from my old life who'd never asked questions when I vanished. Something that whispers power, not screams it, I told her. She smiled over the phone. I have just the thing. 2 weeks later, the mirror reflected a version of me even I barely recognized. Midnight velvet, sculpted shoulders, minimal jewelry, an armor of grace. The dress didn't announce wealth, it implied control. Control is harder to counterfeit than money. I stared at myself for a long moment, not in vanity, but in disbelief. The woman in the reflection looked like she belonged anywhere. In preparation, I studied the guest list. Old colleagues, industry investors, even Serena, still orbiting Julian's spotlight like a satellite that didn't know it was dimming. She'd be there, of course. The new Mrs. Hart Global in everything but title. I didn't hate her. Not anymore. She'd played the game Julian wrote for her. I was simply rewriting the ending. A week before the gala, I attended a smaller networking brunch hosted by the Foundation's advisory board. They were the kind of people who believed civility could be measured in donation amounts. I walked in late, deliberately. Nothing unsettles gatekeepers like someone who doesn't rush to impress them. Ms. Marlowe, the chairwoman said, scanning her notes. Your firm's recent acquisitions are impressive. She didn't recognize me, but she recognized power. We'd love your support on our restoration project. Restoration. The word tasted sweet. They were asking me to fund renovations for a building I already owned. I signed the pledge card with a steady hand. You'll find I'm deeply invested in this hotel's future, I said. By the time I left that brunch, the first whispers had started. Who is she? How did she raise so much capital so fast? Gossip, I'd learned, was an undervalued currency. The more people speculated, the less they questioned. I let their curiosity spread while I finalized the last of my plans. Marcus, my attorney, handled the confidentiality agreements. The hotel staff had been instructed to treat any event bookings by Hart Global as standard contracts until the ownership transfer announcement. Discretion was part of the acquisition clause. On the afternoon of the gala, I arrived early, hours before the guests. The ballroom was a skeleton of what it would soon become. Cables snaking across the floor, floral arrangements waiting for placement, chandeliers dimmed in daylight. The event manager greeted me nervously. She'd seen the paperwork. Everything is in order, Ms. Marlowe, she said, adjusting her clipboard. Will the announcement still happen during the midnight toast? I nodded. Timing is everything. Standing alone in that room, I remembered the last time I'd seen it. Crowded, glittering, and cruel. That night they'd laughed at my absence of status. Tonight, they'd applaud my presence without knowing why, until the reveal peeled back every layer of their arrogance. I traced my fingers along the edge of a marble pillar, feeling the cool permanence of ownership. Mine, I thought. Every inch of it. When the first guests arrived, the transformation began. Cameras flashed, champagne flowed, and conversations rose like orchestrated waves. I stayed near the entrance at first, watching reactions ripple as my name appeared on the donor wall beside the Foundation's top benefactors. Julian's eyes would find it eventually. I wanted to see the moment recognition dawned, the flicker between confusion and fear. As the night deepened, Serena approached me, curiosity laced with the faintest thread of unease. You look familiar, she said, her smile rehearsed. Maybe in another lifetime, I replied, meeting her gaze. She laughed, uncertain, and drifted back toward Julian. I watched her lean in to whisper something. His glance shifted toward me, quick, assessing. For the first time, I saw doubt in his posture. Good. Doubt is the first crack in certainty. When the orchestra paused for the midnight toast, the hotel's general manager stepped forward to make the announcement, microphone trembling in his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "it is my honor to welcome our new majority owner of the Hathaway Hotel, Marlowe Acquisitions Group, led by Ms. L. Marlowe." The room fell into the kind of silence that has weight. Faces turned. Cameras clicked. And across the ballroom, Julian froze, champagne halfway to his lips. His expression, shock, denial, comprehension, was everything I'd waited for. I raised my glass slowly, meeting his stare with the faintest smile. He didn't know yet. Not completely. That revelation would come soon enough, when the contracts crossed his desk and the rent invoices landed in his inbox. But in that instant, surrounded by people who once pretended not to see me, I felt the balance shift. They'd spent a year erasing me from their narrative. Tonight, I'd rewritten the story in permanent ink. Power never announces itself. It arrives quietly, through whispers, through glances, through the way a room tilts toward whoever has the most to lose. The morning after the gala, the Hathaway Hotel was trending, not for its charity proceeds, not for Julian Hart's speech, but for a single line buried in a press release. Ownership of the Hathaway Hotel has officially transferred to Marlowe Acquisitions Group, led by CEO L. Marlowe. The headline spread faster than truth. Who is L? Marlowe? Is she European royalty? A tech heiress? A front for some conglomerate? Every outlet had a theory, and not one of them mentioned my name. I preferred it that way. I'd spent too long being underestimated to surrender that advantage now. Julian called my former assistant that morning. Kelly texted me a screenshot of his message. "Find out everything you can about Marlowe Acquisitions. Immediate priority." His panic was almost poetic. The man who'd once dismissed me as replaceable was now scrambling to identify the ghost sitting at the head of his table. In the days that followed, the whispers multiplied. Investors speculated. Journalists dug. Competitors plotted coffee meetings. But the more they searched, the more invisible I became. My companies were registered across jurisdictions, protected by legal veils thicker than arrogance. Each LLC traced back to another, like a labyrinth designed for the express purpose of confusion. I'd learned that from Julian himself. He'd spent years teaching me how the rich protect their secrets. He just never expected I'd use the lesson against him. Still, power requires maintenance. Marcus, my attorney, set up a temporary office in one of the Hathaway's penthouse suites. The view stretched across the skyline, a constant reminder of how far I'd come. "You know," he said, scrolling through a digital folder, "you could go public. Step into the spotlight. Own the narrative before someone else does." I shook my head. Visibility is what destroyed me the first time. Let them talk. The story's more valuable when it's a mystery. He smiled, recognizing the strategic cruelty in my restraint. Sometimes silence can humiliate louder than words. Meanwhile, the social elite turned my anonymity into obsession. At luncheons and charity teas, women compared theories like currency. She must be old money. No, she's too young. Look at her posture. I heard she bought a controlling stake in Hart Global's suppliers. They weren't wrong, but they weren't right either. That uncertainty became my armor. Serena reached out first. A handwritten note delivered by courier. "You were magnificent the other night. Let's talk. Woman to woman." I kept the letter, not out of sentiment but as documentation. She was starting to sense what Julian hadn't yet, that the universe was tilting. I didn't reply. Julian, on the other hand, wasn't built for ambiguity. 3 days after the gala, he showed up at the hotel lobby unannounced. The front desk called my suite. "A Mr. Hart insists on seeing Ms. Marlowe," the clerk said carefully. I told them to offer him coffee and make him wait. Power isn't measured by how fast you answer. It's measured by how long you make them wait for an answer. After 20 minutes, I descended. The click of my heels echoed through the marble atrium, each step deliberate. Julian stood near the fountain, the same confident stance, but his eyes betrayed him. "Ms. Marlowe," he said, extending his hand. "I wanted to personally welcome you to our city's philanthropic circle." "Our city?" I asked, shaking his hand lightly. "How generous of you to share it." He smiled, brittle around the edges. "You remind me of someone I used to know." "I get that a lot," I said. He tried to probe, questions disguised as charm, curiosity wrapped in civility, but every answer I gave was half a truth, polished enough to be plausible. After 15 minutes, he left with nothing but unease. As the elevator doors closed, I caught his reflection in the mirrored walls, still smiling, but with that flicker of recognition he couldn't quite name. By the end of the week, Serena had called 3 journalists she trusted, feeding them rumors about my mysterious wealth. One article suggested Marlowe Acquisitions had ties to international banking families. Another hinted at political connections. Every misdirection worked in my favor. The more they speculated, the less they understood. That Friday, I hosted my first event as the new owner, a private dinner for select executives, under the pretense of discussing the hotel's rebranding. The guest list included 3 of Julian's closest allies. They didn't realize that by attending, they were effectively defecting. Influence doesn't always require confrontation. Sometimes it's just offering better wine and listening when no one else does. During dessert, one of them leaned toward me. "Ms. Marlowe," he said, lowering his voice, "if you ever consider partnerships in consulting or logistics, my firm would be honored." I smiled. "I'll keep that in mind." By Monday morning, Julian's boardroom was full of empty chairs. His allies weren't betraying him. They were evolving toward survival. Business runs on gravity, and gravity always favors whoever holds the most capital. But I knew better than to celebrate too soon. Revenge, like investing, rewards patience. For every victory, there's a shadow of consequence. And in the distance, beyond the chatter and champagne, I could sense it coming. The moment when the whispers would finally reach Julian's boardroom walls. When they did, they'd bring my name with them, and I was ready. The morning Julian tried to expose me, I was having coffee in the Hathaway's rooftop garden, the same one I'd had renovated into a sanctuary of silence. My phone buzzed once, then again, a cascade of alerts, headlines, mentions, and frantic texts from Marcus. He's gone public. Julian had decided to wage war the only way he knew how, through spectacle. At exactly 9 o'clock, he'd called a press conference from Hart Global's headquarters, standing at the same podium where I once presented our first joint proposal. Cameras flashed as he declared, "We have reason to believe that Marlowe Acquisitions is not what it seems." He spoke with the confidence of a man who still mistook charisma for evidence. "Anonymous sources have linked the firm to insider dealings and offshore manipulation." He'd rehearsed that line. I could hear it in his cadence. He wanted to paint me as a fraud before anyone discovered he was the one built on illusion. By noon, the internet was ablaze. Threads dissected every rumor, every grainy photo of me leaving the gala, every speculative profile. Who is she really? Why is she hiding? Is this another Elizabeth Holmes story? I watched the comments flow, detached but deliberate. Reputation isn't about truth. It's about narrative velocity. If you control the acceleration, you control the outcome. Marcus burst into my office, waving his tablet. "We can sue for defamation right now. The man's insane." "Let him talk," I said. "Every word he speaks is another inch of rope." Julian underestimated how much I'd learned about optics, the third battlefield after money and power. While he fed the fire, I quietly positioned the extinguisher. By 2 o'clock, my communications team, led by Diana, a former journalist I'd poached months earlier, released a statement so precise it could have been cut from glass. Marlowe Acquisitions stands by its ethical and fully audited practices. We welcome transparency and have already scheduled an independent review by the same firm Hart Global uses for its annual reporting. It was surgical, professional, unbothered, confident. The subtext was clear. We weren't hiding. We were better. Then came the real strike. At 4 p.m., the financial disclosure site Equinox Ledger published an exposé, not about me, but about Hart Global. Anonymous documents, carefully curated by Marcus's team, of course, revealed discrepancies in Julian's expense reports, suggesting company funds had been used for personal indulgences, luxury vacations, private dining, even a $50,000 jewelry purchase under client relations. The timing was no coincidence. By sunset, the story had eclipsed his accusations entirely. The same journalists who'd echoed his press conference were now asking if his outrage had been a smokescreen. Online sentiment flipped with ruthless efficiency. I didn't gloat, not outwardly. I knew that revenge works best when it looks like indifference. I spent the evening finalizing the Hathaway's renovation plans, approving design mock-ups for the new ballroom. The project was symbolic, a space reborn from scandal, exactly like me. Serena called that night. I almost ignored it, but curiosity won. "You need to stop," she said, her voice trembling between fear and anger. He's unraveling. This isn't who you are, isn't it? I asked softly. You'd be surprised what people become when they're forced to start over. There was silence on the line, then a sigh. He's not sleeping. He's convinced you're out to destroy him. I'm not out to destroy him, I said. I'm just making sure he understands what destruction feels like. After I hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and reread an old email chain from our early days at Heart Global. Back then, Julian and I used to send each other midnight ideas, bursts of strategy and excitement. One line from him stood out now. In this business, whoever controls the story controls the market. He'd been right. He just never expected me to learn faster. The next morning, the financial regulators announced an inquiry into Heart Global's accounting practices. The company's shares dipped 8% before trading paused. Julian's name began trending again, this time beside words like embezzlement and internal investigation. I walked into the lobby of my hotel, greeted by staff who now knew exactly who I was. Word had spread internally. Confidentiality was one thing, reverence another. The concierge nodded as I passed. Good morning, Ms. Reed. It was the first time in a year someone had said my real name in public. I didn't flinch. I smiled. That afternoon, Marcus found me reviewing blueprints in the penthouse suite. You're officially the most talked about woman in the city, he said, half proud, half concerned. Let them talk, I replied. They're finally saying my name for the right reasons. But power always invites retaliation. Julian wasn't finished. Not yet. The whispers I'd planted had turned into noise, and noise can distort even the sharpest message. Somewhere beneath his downfall, he was plotting something desperate. I could feel it, a pulse of chaos beneath the calm. Still, I wasn't afraid. I'd built an empire from silence. I could survive his noise, because exposure works both ways. And soon, the world would see exactly how transparent Julian Hart really was. Julian always mistook desperation for strategy. When men like him start losing control, they don't reflect. They retaliate. 2 weeks after the inquiry began, I started noticing the signs. New calls from unfamiliar numbers, discreet inquiries about my personal history, and a private investigator lingering just long enough in the hotel lobby to be noticed. Marcus confirmed it first. He's hired a firm out of Chicago, he said, dropping a folder on my desk. They specialize in digging for dirt, old debts, aliases, anything that can be spun. He sighed. He's trying to make you look like a fraud before the board ousts him. I leaned back in my chair, watching the city glitter through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Let him dig, I said. He'll only find the bones he buried himself. Still, I tightened the perimeter. Every document tied to Marlowe acquisitions was triple encrypted. Diana scrubbed our press archives, ensuring that every story about me focused on innovation and restoration, not mystery. The narrative was shifting. The media now painted me as a reclusive business genius who'd revitalized a historic landmark and revitalized female entrepreneurship programs through my foundation. Every whisper Julian started only made my legend grow, but arrogance dies slowly. On the third Friday of that month, Heart Global hosted its annual investor dinner. I wasn't invited, but I attended anyway. The event was held, predictably, at a rival luxury venue, because he couldn't bear to face the marble floors I owned. My name wasn't on the guest list, but money has its privileges. A discreet check to the event coordinator and a borrowed seat card later, I was at table 7, close enough to watch him unravel. Julian took the stage, his smile stretched thin. The lighting was harsh, unflattering. His voice carried that brittle edge of someone pretending confidence while the ground shifts beneath them. We've had a challenging quarter, he began. But challenges create champions. I almost laughed. The projection screen behind him displayed numbers, downward trends, losses hidden behind corporate jargon. His investors exchanged cautious glances. Then he made his move. Before we proceed, he said, I'd like to address the misleading rumors circulating about me and my former associate. He paused, letting the word former hang in the air. Maya Reed, now calling herself Elle Marlowe, has engaged in what I believe to be a calculated campaign to discredit Heart Global and manipulate market perception. There it was, the mask ripped off. The room stirred. He was naming me publicly for the first time. I stood before my mind had fully caught up. That's an interesting accusation, Julian, I said, loud enough for the microphone to pick up. Heads turned, phones discreetly lifted. The sound tech must have assumed I was part of the program because my voice echoed across the speakers. Julian froze, mid-sentence. Maya, he stammered. This isn't professional, I finished for him. You're right, it isn't. But neither was falsifying your expense reports or diverting client funds for personal luxury. The crowd shifted like a single organism. Shock, curiosity, hunger. Those claims are unsubstantiated, he snapped. Oh, I agree, I said smoothly, reaching into my clutch, which is why I brought substantiation. I held up a slim folder, Marcus's careful compilation of public records, all legally accessible, all devastatingly damning. Filed this morning with the Securities Bureau. Transparency, as you once told me, is the currency of trust. The room went silent except for the faint clicking of camera shutters. Julian's composure fractured under the light. You're destroying yourself, he hissed. No, I said quietly enough that only the first few rows heard. I'm finishing what you started. Security approached, unsure whether to escort me out or applaud. I saved them the trouble, setting the folder on the stage and walking toward the exit. The murmurs followed like a rising tide. By the time I reached the door, investors were already crowding each other for a closer look. Outside, the air tasted electric. Diana met me at the curb with the car running. That was live-streamed, she said. Half the finance world just watched him implode. I exhaled slowly. Good. Now they'll stop asking who I am and start asking who he was. That night, I didn't celebrate. I sat in the dark of my penthouse, the city lights flickering like applause from a distance. Victory always feels quieter than you imagine. There's relief, yes, but also a kind of mourning for the version of yourself that had to be small, patient, invisible just to survive. Julian's empire began collapsing in real time. Within 48 hours, his board demanded an emergency meeting. 2 of his executives resigned. Major clients suspended contracts. His name, once printed in glossy profiles, now crawled across ticker headlines accompanied by words like investigation, ethics breach, and resignation pending. He sent one last email, short and venomous. You'll regret this. I didn't reply. Some words don't deserve oxygen. A week later, an anonymous source leaked video footage from the investor dinner. My confrontation became viral shorthand for poetic justice. The Reed reversal, they called it. Think pieces, interviews, op-eds about women reclaiming power in male-dominated industries flooded my inbox. The story wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about visibility. Julian had tried to bury me with lies. Instead, he'd built my monument. And beneath the noise, a new realization took root. Revenge had been my survival, but legacy would be my resurrection. Bury might. The thing about revenge is that it never ends cleanly. It's not a blade. It's a ripple. And when the water finally stills, you start to see what else you've pulled under. Julian's downfall hit the industry like a meteor. In the first week after the investor dinner, Hart Global's shares fell 22%. Within 2, his board announced his temporary leave of absence. Within 3, it wasn't temporary anymore. He'd resigned to focus on personal matters. Translation, exiled. The press devoured him. Interviews he'd once begged for now painted him as a cautionary tale, the man who mistook brilliance for ownership. I didn't attend any of the galas that month. Invitations piled up on my desk, thin envelopes full of ego and opportunity. I declined them all. I told Diana we needed quiet. She disagreed, of course. You're the story now, Maya, she said. They want your face, your voice, your quote. You can't stay a myth forever, but myths are safer than mortals. The moment the cameras turn toward you, they also start looking for cracks. The first crack appeared in my inbox. A message from Serena. He's not eating. He's barely speaking. He blames you, but I think he finally understands you were never the enemy. I deleted it, then restored it, then deleted it again. Serena wasn't my concern. She'd chosen her side long before this war started. Still, her words clung like smoke. I hadn't planned to destroy Julian completely, just the version of him that destroyed me. But destruction doesn't ask for permission once it begins. 2 weeks later, Marcus handed me a file across the table at our morning briefing. You should see this. It was a foreclosure notice. Julian's penthouse. The same one he'd bought the month he forced me out of Hart Global. The property had been leveraged against company stock, which was now worth a fraction of what it had been. His empire had eaten itself alive. Should I feel sorry for him? I asked. Marcus tilted his head. Do you? I didn't answer. I just stared at the document. Pity was dangerous. It softened the edges I'd spent a year sharpening. The media turned its attention toward me, as Diana predicted. Requests flooded in. Forbes, Vanity Fair, TED Talks. The woman who rewrote corporate power dynamics. The headline made me sound like a movement, not a person. For a moment, I considered embracing it. A narrative like that could change everything for women in business. But with attention came distortion. An op-ed questioned my ethics, how I'd use shell companies, anonymous acquisitions, and quiet strategy. If a man did it, we'd call it ruthless brilliance, Diana said during one of our late-night work sessions. When a woman does it, they call it manipulation. She was right. Still, the articles unsettled me. I'd spent so long being erased that now, being magnified felt equally unnatural. The foundation board invited me to headline their next gala, the same event where I'd been dismissed as a nobody months before. The irony wasn't lost on me. This time, they wanted me at the center table, under the chandeliers I owned. That night, as I prepared my speech, I caught my reflection in the hotel's mirrored wall. The woman staring back looked polished, untouchable. Yet beneath the perfect contour and couture armor, I saw fatigue, the kind that comes from carrying both vengeance and victory. When I stepped onto the stage, applause erupted like a storm. The same faces that once ignored me now leaned forward, eager for wisdom. I spoke calmly, choosing words that disguised confession as philosophy. Power, I said, isn't about destroying those who underestimated you. It's about ensuring no one else gets crushed the same way. They clapped. Some even stood, believing it was grace. They didn't realize it was guilt. Afterward, as I navigated a maze of compliments and business cards, a woman stopped me, one of the junior analysts from Hart Global. "Ms. Reed," she said quietly, "thank you. Seeing what you did, it makes the rest of us believe we're not crazy for wanting more." I smiled at her, genuinely. "You're not crazy," I said. "You're early." That night, I found another message waiting, this time from Julian himself. "You win. Happy now?" The words were sharp, but I could almost hear the exhaustion behind them. I closed the message without replying. There was nothing left to say. Revenge doesn't end with a conversation. It ends with silence. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. Somewhere between his ruin and my rise, I'd crossed an invisible line. Power had become its own addiction. The applause, the respect, the quiet fear in people's eyes. It filled the same void Julian once did, but without warmth, just control. A week later, Serena appeared in the hotel lobby. No cameras, no entourage, just her, in a plain coat, clutching a small envelope. "He's leaving the city," she said. "He wanted you to have this." I almost refused it, but curiosity won. Inside was a photograph, Julian and me, taken the year Hart Global launched. We were standing side by side, young, ambitious, blind. On the back, in his handwriting, "You were always better at building than I was." For the first time in months, my throat tightened, not from sadness, but from the realization that I'd finally outgrown the battlefield. Vengeance had rebuilt my name, but forgiveness, that would rebuild me. I placed the photograph in my desk drawer, beside the first gala invitation, and closed it gently. There would be another chapter, another climb, another empire. But this one? This was over, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like peace. My success changes its taste once the battle is over. For a year, I'd imagined triumph as champagne and applause, a golden hum of vindication that would erase every bruise Julian left on my career. But when the noise finally died down, what remained was silence, and the realization that silence, too, demands management. I woke up every day in the penthouse suite of the Hathaway, surrounded by everything I used to dream of. Italian marble floors, linen that smelled like new beginnings, an empire at my fingertips. Yet I found myself counting invoices, reading contracts, double-checking numbers I already knew were right. Control had become my refuge and my prison. "Rest," Diana said one morning, dropping another stack of press requests on my desk. "Let the myth breathe. People need to miss you before they see you again." She was right. Public fascination was peaking. Every magazine wanted my face on its cover. Every investor wanted a meeting. They called me the Phantom Founder, the woman who rose from erasure to ownership. But myths grow teeth. They start to eat their creator. The first bite came in the form of a lawsuit, not from Julian, but from one of his former board members, who claimed that my acquisitions were predatory. Marcus dismissed it as posturing. "He's trying to scare you into a settlement," he said. But I felt the sting. Every headline about me now came with the word controversial. At night, I walked through the quiet hotel halls, remembering the woman who once hid behind her own anonymity. That version of me had been smaller, but freer. Now I was visible, respected, and constantly performing calm. I missed the luxury of being underestimated. The financial world had turned me into its latest morality play. Women in leadership panels quoted me. Business schools analyzed my strategy. Some called me a pioneer. Others whispered calculating. I read every article, even the cruel ones, because I needed to know which narrative was winning. When you've built your survival on controlling perception, letting go feels like drowning. Serena sent another message. This one wasn't about Julian. It was about herself. He left, sold the penthouse, moved somewhere quiet. I'm staying, trying to rebuild. You were right about him, and about me. There was no bitterness, just honesty. I wrote back this time. We all rebuild eventually. Some of us just start with ashes. She replied with a single word, thank you. I didn't realize until then how exhausted I was from fighting ghosts. Julian was gone, but the battlefield remained inside me. I'd learned to weaponize silence, patience, humiliation, but never peace. The truth was, I didn't know what to do with stillness. When Marcus suggested expanding internationally, I agreed without hesitation. Asia, Europe, wherever opportunity lives, I said. Maybe if I kept moving, I wouldn't have to feel the stillness creeping closer. He warned me. Empires collapse from within, not from competition. I smiled, pretending not to hear. The new ventures grew faster than expected. Within 6 months, Marlowe Acquisitions had holdings in 7 countries. I was on magazine covers I'd once bought at airport kiosks. Forbes named me among the 50 most powerful women in finance. Power had become not just armor, but identity. Without it, I wasn't sure who Maya Reed was anymore. Then came the awards gala, the one that cemented everything. Same chandeliers, same guests, but this time I was the reason they'd gathered. As I walked to the stage to accept the award for Visionary of the Year, the applause felt heavier than before. Applause can sound like approval, but it can also sound like expectation. Thank you, I began, holding the microphone with a practiced steadiness. This isn't about revenge or rivalry, it's about reclamation. The right to exist in a world that told us we were supporting characters. The crowd erupted. Cameras flashed. But when I stepped off the stage, I didn't feel victorious. I felt hollow. After the gala, I found myself in the same rooftop garden where I'd first read the headlines about Julian's collapse. The city below pulsed with light, but none of it reached me. I realized then that I'd spent years proving something to people who no longer mattered. Every deal, every acquisition, every headline was still written in the shadow of a man who no longer existed. That night, I called my mother. I hadn't spoken to her in months. You sound tired, she said gently. Are you finally done fighting? I don't know if I remember how to stop, I admitted. She paused, then said something I'll never forget. Winning isn't healing, Maya. It's just surviving with better furniture. I laughed softly, but it landed like truth. The next morning, I drafted a proposal, not for another acquisition, but for something different. A foundation supporting women starting businesses after corporate burnout. Diana looked at the plan and raised an eyebrow. You're serious? I think it's time I built something that doesn't have an enemy, I said. For the first time in years, my voice didn't sound like strategy. It sounded like intention. I named it the Phoenix Initiative, not for what I'd destroyed, but for what I wanted to see rise. The logo was a simple outline of a bird mid-flight, wings not yet perfect, but reaching. It felt right. Maybe the world would call it redemption. Maybe they'd call it marketing. I didn't care. For once, I wasn't building a fortress. I was building a doorway. And for the first time since the night they called me a nobody, I wasn't planning my next move. I was learning how to stay still, and still stand tall. And starting over felt strangely familiar. Maybe because rebuilding had always been my second language. But this time, there was no enemy to outsmart, no secret acquisition to hide behind. Just a blank canvas, and the terrifying freedom that came with it. The Phoenix Initiative began quietly, without a press release or a photo shoot. I rented a modest office downtown, away from the marble and chandeliers. The walls were bare at first, echoing with possibility. My team was small. Diana, who refused to leave my side, an accountant named Ellie who'd once been laid off during a corporate merger, and 2 young interns fresh out of business school, wide-eyed and idealistic. "This place smells like hope," Ellie said on our first morning. I laughed, but she wasn't wrong. It did. Our mission was simple: fund and mentor women who wanted to build businesses from authenticity, not ego. No polished narratives, no glossy facades, just real work, real ambition. For every woman who'd been told she was too emotional, too inexperienced, too something, we wanted to be proof that resilience could be capital. At first, the world didn't quite understand what I was doing. The press tried to spin it as an image cleanse, a redemption arc after the corporate blood feud with Julian Hart, but I didn't correct them. Let them tell whatever story kept their clicks alive. The truth was quieter and infinitely more personal. During our first selection round, we met more than 100 applicants. Some came with business plans written on napkins. Others brought full decks and prototypes. One woman, a single mother named Claire, wanted to open a catering company that hired survivors of domestic abuse. When she finished her pitch, the room was silent. "That's it," I said finally. "That's exactly why we're here." Funding Claire's dream felt different from any deal I'd ever signed. There was no strategy to exploit, no weakness to capitalize on. It was the first time I'd invested in something that didn't revolve around revenge or profit. Watching her cry when we handed her the check reminded me of something I'd forgotten. Success doesn't have to come at someone else's expense, but even growth built on goodness casts shadows. Investors who'd once begged for a seat at my table began to grumble. "Charity doesn't scale," one of them told me at a conference. "You're wasting influence." I smiled politely. "Then it's mine to waste." Behind closed doors, I still battled restlessness. The rush of revenge had spoiled me. Serenity felt like withdrawal. Late nights found me back at the Hathaway rooftop, staring at the skyline like it held the next problem I could solve. I wondered if Julian ever felt the same. The itch to prove, to conquer, to be seen. Power, I realized, doesn't just corrupt, it conditions. One afternoon, Diana burst into my office with her laptop. "You need to see this." On the screen was a live stream from a business seminar in Chicago. The guest speaker was Julian. He looked different, thinner, older, stripped of arrogance. Gone was the polished suit and that smug half-smile. His tone was subdued, almost humble. "If you're lucky," he said, "failure gives you a mirror. I spent years blaming others for the reflection. Now I'm learning to look longer." The audience applauded politely. Diana looked at me carefully. "Are you okay?" I didn't answer immediately. I watched him finish his speech, thanking the crowd with the same hands that once signed my exile papers. Then I closed the laptop. "Yeah," I said finally. "Maybe I am." That night, I went home early and cooked for the first time in months. Nothing glamorous, just pasta and wine. I ate in silence, letting the quiet fill the space that ambition usually occupied. For once, I wasn't strategizing. I was existing. The following week, the Phoenix Initiative's first cohort launched. 23 women from 6 different countries gathered in a renovated warehouse we'd transformed into a workspace. The energy was electric, raw, full of hunger that reminded me of who I'd been before Julian, before Heart Global, before the Gala. I opened the orientation myself. "You've all been underestimated," I began, looking around the room. "Good. That means you're dangerous. It means you've already learned the art of invisibility, and that's the first step toward transformation. This program isn't about teaching you how to fit in. It's about teaching you how to be undeniable." Applause erupted, but this time it didn't feel performative. It felt shared. When the session ended, Claire approached me with tears in her eyes. "You changed my life," she said. I shook my head. "No, Claire. You changed mine." Later that night, as I stood by my office window watching the city lights shimmer against the glass, I realized something profound. Power built on vengeance is fragile. It demands constant defense. But power built on purpose? That's permanent. Julian's face occasionally resurfaced in the media, usually attached to quotes about ethics and redemption. Sometimes I read them, sometimes I didn't. I didn't feel anger anymore, just distance, like remembering a storm after years of clear skies. The woman who'd once been called a nobody at the Gala was gone. In her place stood someone who no longer needed to prove anything. The phoenix doesn't rise to show it can survive fire. It rises because it remembers how to fly. I used to think the past stayed buried if you worked hard enough to outgrow it. Turns out the past doesn't stay buried. It waits. It bides its time until the present is quiet enough to hear it whisper. The Phoenix Initiative had entered its second year. and the world had finally stopped calling it a pet project. We had offices in 3 cities, 47 women in our mentorship network, and enough media coverage to fill a lifetime of redemption arcs. But with visibility came scrutiny. It started with an email. Subject line, question about your past employment. The sender was a journalist I vaguely recognized, one of those investigative types who'd built a career exposing hypocrisy behind philanthropic empires. His message was polite, surgical. He wanted to clarify the timeline between my departure from Hart Global and the founding of Marlowe Acquisitions. He even attached a document, an old NDA I'd signed the week Julian pushed me out. Marcus read it over my shoulder. That's supposed to be sealed. How the hell did he get it? I didn't answer. I already knew. Julian. Even after all this time, his name still carried a tremor in the air. I hadn't spoken to him in over a year, not since his self-appointed exile. I'd seen photos, him teaching leadership workshops, writing essays about ethics, smiling beside nonprofit boards that mistook remorse for redemption. He'd reinvented himself the way men like him always do, by turning their failures into speaking fees. Do we respond? Marcus asked. No, I said. We redirect. That evening, I drafted an open letter, not to the journalist, but to the world. I wrote about power, transparency, and the evolution of failure. Every success story begins with an ending, I typed. Mine began with a betrayal, but what defines us isn't what we lose. It's what we rebuild after. Diana read it and smiled. You just turned a scandal into scripture. The letter went viral overnight. News outlets quoted it. Professors assigned it. And women sent messages by the thousands. Thank you for saying what we can't. The journalist's piece ran 2 days later, but his angle fell flat. Facts couldn't wound me anymore. I'd already confessed the truth better than he could. Still, something about the timing felt deliberate. I couldn't shake the sense that Julian's fingerprints were on it. So when I received an embossed invitation to a Global Ethics and Leadership Summit, I wasn't surprised to see his name listed as the keynote speaker. I almost declined. Almost. When I walked into that conference hall months later, it felt like stepping into a mirrored version of the Gala years ago. The same kind of lighting, the same expensive perfume of ambition. But this time, no one questioned my invitation. My seat had my name engraved in gold. Julian took the stage wearing humility like a tailored suit. We live in a culture obsessed with winning, he said, but real power comes from accountability. The crowd nodded, entranced by his transformation narrative. When he finished, the applause was warm and full of forgiveness. During the reception, our eyes met across the room. He approached slowly, as though crossing a minefield he'd mapped himself. Maya, he said. My name, my real name, sounded strange coming from him. Julian, I let the syllables fall flat. You found your second act, I see. He laughed softly. I suppose we both did. We stood in silence for a beat, the air between us heavy with what we weren't saying. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and handed me an envelope. It's not what you think, he said. No tricks, just something I should have given you years ago. Inside was a letter dated the day after I'd left Hart Global. The handwriting was unmistakably his, though the words were uncharacteristically honest. You were right. You built the company, not me. I stole your future because I was terrified of being ordinary. I'm sorry. I read it twice, the ink blurring slightly where it had once been wet with hesitation. Why now? I asked. Because you deserve to know I'm not running anymore, he said. And because every time they call me a better man, I hear your silence behind it. There was no satisfaction in hearing him say it. No fireworks, no closure, just stillness. I forgave you a long time ago, I said finally. Not for you. For me. He nodded, his eyes damp but steady. I'm glad you finally built something that wasn't about me. I smiled faintly. So am I. As he turned to leave, I felt a curious peace settle over me. Not the fragile kind born of victory, but the grounded kind that comes from understanding. Julian had once defined my pain. Now he was just part of my past, reduced to a lesson I'd already learned. Later that night, back at the Phoenix office, I found Diana waiting with news. The Foundation's been invited to partner with the United Nations Women's Entrepreneurship Division, she said, breathless. It's global now, Maya. You've built something unstoppable. For the first time, I didn't think of what Julian would say, or how the press would spin it. I just felt the quiet pulse of purpose, steady, alive, mine. The next morning, as the sun bled gold through the blinds, I pinned Julian's letter to my office wall, not as a trophy, but as proof. Proof that the past doesn't vanish. It transforms. Every echo eventually fades. You just have to decide what you'll hear when the silence returns. It's strange how success, when it becomes sustainable, stops feeling like victory and starts feeling like responsibility. The Phoenix Initiative was no longer a project. It was an organism. It breathed, grew, evolved, demanded. And like any living thing, it began to outgrow me. Our expansion into Europe happened faster than I expected. Within months, we had branches in London, Berlin, and Lisbon. We were partnering with banks, universities, and private investors who wanted to be associated with the word empowerment, whether or not they understood what it meant. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent years tearing down a system built on power imbalance, and now that same system was knocking at my door with sponsorship checks and photo ops. Diana called it the full circle trap. "They'll buy your message, Maya," she warned, "and sell it back to you wrapped in their branding. If you let them." She wasn't wrong. One morning, I walked into a board meeting where our new European partners proposed renaming the foundation Phoenix Global Ventures. Sleeker, more corporate, less emotional. I listened in silence as they pitched synergy charts and brand alignment strategies, words that sounded a lot like the meetings I used to sit through at Heart Global. When they finished, I said simply, "We're not here to look powerful. We're here to make power accessible." The room went quiet, the kind of silence that tells you you've made half the room love you, and the other half plan your removal. After the meeting, Diana found me in the hallway. "You could have compromised," she said. "I did," I replied. I didn't walk out. That night, I stayed late at the office, reviewing reports under the hum of fluorescent light. My reflection in the glass caught me off guard. Tailored suit, flawless posture, cold focus. I looked exactly like Julian in those old boardroom photos. The realization hit me like a bruise. Power, even when earned, still seduces the ego the same way it seduces the corrupt. I shut the laptop and walked out, needing air. Outside, the city was alive with movement. Delivery bikes, late-night laughter, the hum of humanity that didn't care who owned what. I stood there, anonymous among thousands, and for the first time in years, I let myself not be in charge. The next morning, I called Claire, the first woman we ever funded. Her catering company had exploded into success, employing dozens of women rebuilding their lives. "Come run a session for the new cohort," I asked her. "They need to see what real leadership looks like." She laughed. "You're the one who taught me how to lead." "No," I said. "I taught you how to win. You taught me why it matters." When she spoke to the group later that week, I watched from the back of the room as she told her story. Not polished, not rehearsed, just real. She cried halfway through, and no one judged her. They cried with her. In that moment, I understood what the next evolution of the Phoenix Initiative needed to be. It wasn't about replication. It was about succession. Legacy wasn't control. It was trust. I gathered my executive team that Friday. "Starting next quarter," I said, "we're decentralizing. Each region will elect its own director from within the program." The announcement landed like a bomb. One of the newer advisors, a man with an Ivy League resume and too much confidence, frowned. "You're giving away power." "I'm multiplying it," I corrected. There was pushback, of course. Investors hated unpredictability. Autonomy doesn't photograph well, but I stood firm. The empire I'd built through revenge couldn't end as another hierarchy dressed in moral branding. If I was going to lead, it had to mean something different. In the weeks that followed, the shift began. Women who'd once deferred to me started taking the lead in meetings, designing programs, challenging policies. I felt the edges of my authority dissolve, and surprisingly, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like evolution. One evening, Diana came into my office with a bottle of wine. "You're really doing it," she said. "You're making yourself obsolete." I smiled. "That's the point." We toasted quietly as the city lights blinked beyond the glass. "You know," she added, "most people build legacies so they'll be remembered. You're building one so you can be forgotten. Maybe that's freedom," I said. In the months that followed, I stepped further back from the spotlight. Claire became regional director of North America. A young woman named Aisha took over our European expansion. The press tried to frame it as a scandal. Maya Reed retreats from her own empire. But for once, I didn't respond. Let them misinterpret peace as weakness. They always did. On my last day in the office, I walked through the empty halls, touching the walls like farewells. I stopped at the photo wall we'd built, faces of every woman we'd funded, smiling mid-dream. At the very center was the motto we'd chosen on day one: rise, then teach others how. I smiled, took one last look, and left my keycard on the desk. Outside, the air felt lighter than it had in years. I wasn't CEO. I wasn't the woman who owned the hotel. I wasn't even the story anymore. I was finally just Maya, and for the first time, that was enough. I hadn't planned to go back. The Hathaway Hotel had become a symbol, a monument to a version of me that no longer existed. Yet one gray afternoon, almost 2 years after I'd stepped down from the Phoenix Initiative, I found myself standing on its marble steps again. Same glass facade, same golden crest above the revolving doors, same hum of quiet luxury. But everything felt smaller, or maybe I'd just grown. Inside, the lobby was nearly identical to the night of the gala when they'd called me a nobody. The chandeliers still spilled light like liquid wealth, and the scent of gardenias lingered in the air. But now, no one looked at me twice. There were no murmurs, no pointing. I wasn't Maya Reed, the scandal, the story, the billionaire. I was just another woman checking in. The receptionist smiled. "Welcome back to the Hathaway, Ms. Reed. We've been expecting you." Expecting me. That word used to thrill me. Now it made me smile, soft and tired. "Just one night," I said. As the elevator carried me upward, I caught my reflection in the mirrored walls. Older, maybe, but not diminished. The lines around my eyes told stories of laughter, not war. I'd traded the sharp armor of ambition for something lighter, something real. My suite hadn't changed much. The same panoramic view of the skyline, the same velvet curtains, the same piano near the window. I walked to the glass and looked out. The city glowed beneath me, full of the lives and dreams of people who didn't know my name, and I felt a peace I'd never known when I owned the place. On the desk, a note awaited in elegant handwriting. "Welcome home," no signature. I recognized Diana's style. She still ran the initiative, though she'd renamed it simply Phoenix. No more foundations, no corporate pretense, just a movement. It had become something organic, unstoppable, and she'd done it without me. That was the greatest victory of all. I poured a glass of wine and sank into the sofa. For a long time, I just sat there, listening to the quiet. I thought about all the versions of me that had walked through these halls. The woman who'd hidden her success, the one who'd plotted her revenge, the one who'd tasted victory and found it hollow. Each of them still lived inside me, but none of them ruled me anymore. My phone buzzed. A message from Claire. "Dinner tomorrow? I'll bring the team. The girls want to meet you." I smiled. Of course. The world I'd built had outlived my presence in it. That, I realized, was legacy. Not marble floors or glossy headlines, but people who kept building long after you stopped. As the evening deepened, I walked to the grand ballroom. It was empty, set for another event later that night. I stepped onto the same spot where Julian once raised his glass and toasted to my failure. The air was still, dust particles floating in the golden light. I could almost see that night again. His smirk, the laughter, the weight of humiliation that had burned itself into memory. But memory, like revenge, loses its edge when you stop feeding it. I closed my eyes and let it fade. When I opened them again, all I saw was space, wide, open, full of possibility. A hotel staff member passed by and paused. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said. "It is," I replied. "Do you ever get used to it?" She smiled. "Never. That's the best part." After she left, I sat at one of the tables and placed my palms flat on the white linen. "You did it," I whispered. Not to the room, not to the past, but to myself. Not the vengeful version who needed to prove something, the one who finally understood what it meant to let go. Before midnight, I went down to the bar. A jazz band played softly, the same kind of music that had once accompanied my quiet rage. The bartender, a young man with kind eyes, asked, "Would you like the usual, Ms. Reed?" I laughed. "I'm not sure what that is anymore. Surprise me." He mixed something delicate and unfamiliar. Lavender, citrus, a hint of something floral. "This one's called Serenity," he said. I took a sip. "Fitting," I murmured. For a while, I just listened. To the hum of voices, to laughter, to the ordinary sounds of life moving on. When I finished my drink, I left a generous tip and returned to my suite. At dawn, The city stretched awake beneath a sky of pale gold. I stood by the window, coffee in hand, watching sunlight spill across the same skyline that had once felt like a battlefield. Now it was just home. On the desk, I wrote a short note for myself and tucked it into the drawer. You survived. You built. You let go. I left the keycard beside it. As I walked out of the room, I didn't look back. The door clicked shut. A soft, final sound. Outside, the air smelled of rain and renewal. The streets glistened, the world unbothered by the ghosts it carried. I slipped into the crowd. Unrecognizable, unremarkable, free. They once called me a nobody at the Gala. Now I was nobody again. But this time, by choice. And that was everything.